Hi, welcome to my Parsha shiur. We're going to be discussing Parshas Chukas. Today's shiur is sponsored by Ronnie Brandt Spitzer in memory of her grandmother, Judith Brandt Goldsher, Erika Bas Baruch Alei Shalom, whose yahrzeit is on the 20th of Shvat. May her neshama have an aliyah. May we all be zoicha to see Tchias HaMeisim. Now, it is without question the most baffling punishment in the entire Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, the ultimate servant of God, described by the Rambam as the greatest prophet who ever lived, the man who faced down Pharaoh, who split the sea, who brought the Torah down from heaven, and who guided a grumbling, quarrelsome nation through 40 years of wilderness wandering. That man hits a rock, and God says, "Sorry, mate, that's it. You're done. You're not going into the promised land." It's the kind of judgment that raises eyebrows, unjustifiably so, especially when you look closely at the scene in question. The episode took place at Mei Merivah. Miriam has just died, and immediately afterward there's no water. So what do the people do? What Jews have always done best: they complain. Moshe and Aaron, facing yet another wave of public outrage, are taken aback by the sheer intensity of the complaints. They retreat to the Ohel Moed, where God instructs Moshe to speak to the rock, the same rock that had miraculously delivered water to the nation in the past for 40 years. But instead of speaking, Moshe gathers the people and says, "Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you from this rock?" Then he strikes the rock, not once, but twice. And sure enough, water gushes out. The people drink, crisis averted. Well, not exactly. God turns to Moshe and Aaron and delivers a painful blow. "Because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel," God says, "you shall not bring this congregation into the land that I have given them." Wait, what just happened? Well, guess what? For generations, commentators have wrestled with this exact question. What exactly was Moshe's sin? Why is the Torah so unclear? Why would God do this to Moshe, the man who practically gave up his life for God's people? Rashi gives us the classic explanation. God told Moshe to speak to the rock, but instead Moshe hit it. This undermined the intended miracle. God wanted the people to see that nature itself obeys his word. If Moshe had spoken and water had emerged, it would have been a sanctification of God's name, a Kiddush Hashem. But by hitting the rock and not speaking to it, Moshe reduced the miracle, defaulting to force over faith. But not everyone is convinced by Rashi's explanation. Ramban, in particular, strongly objects to Rashi's take and offers an alternative. He says the sin lies in Moshe's words, "Shall we bring forth water?" It sounds like we, Moshe and Aaron, are producing the water. The people might have misunderstood what Moshe was saying. They might have thought Moshe had the power to produce the water, and it wasn't God. But that was the failure that exactly was the failure of sanctification. Moshe didn't make clear that the miracle was God's miracle. Then there's the Rambam, who, in his introduction to Pirkei Avos, offers a totally different perspective. According to the Rambam, the issue was Moshe's anger. He angrily called the people moirim, rebels, and this outburst suggested to the nation that not just Moshe, but God was angry with them, when he wasn't. That, says the Rambam, is a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, distorting his emotional posture to his people. Bottom line, Moshe misrepresented God. A prophet's job is not just to communicate God's words, but also to communicate God's essence. All good explanations, but, and excuse me for asking, which one of these explanations is the correct one? Is it hitting instead of speaking? Is it arrogance in taking credit? Is it a lapse into anger? Because they're all very different from each other, and they can't all be right. Each explanation sheds light on a different layer of leadership and responsibility. Rashi focuses on obedience to divine instruction. Ramban worries about appearances and ego. The Rambam zeroes in on emotional correspondence, representing God's love and compassion, not just his law. But it doesn't stop there, because then there are modern interpretations. Rabbi Pinchas Kahn, in his paper Moses at the Waters of Merivah, a case of divine pedagogy, suggests something much more psychological. Well, he would, because he has a degree in psychology. Rabbi Kahn suggests that Moshe was traumatized. Not long before Mei Merivah, he faced the rebellion of Korach, a deep betrayal from within the leadership class. He watched the earth open and swallow people up whole. He faced down a violent mob. He was utterly exhausted. Then his sister died, and then the people complained again. From Moshe's perspective, it's Refidim all over again. It's the same crisis, the same thirst, the same whining and moaning. But actually, it's not. These aren't the same people. That generation died in the wilderness. These are their children, their grandchildren. They aren't rioting. They're just scared. But Moshe can't see it. He responds out of habit, out of scar tissue. And in that moment, he misses what God wants from him. God wants a gentle speech. Moshe hits them between the eyes. The idea here is that sometimes leaders become prisoners of their own history. They see the future through the lens of the past. They overreact, they misread, and when they do that, the consequences can be seismic. There's lots of examples of this phenomenon from secular history. Take, for example, King Richard III of England. He came to power in 1483 during the chaotic aftermath of the War of the Roses, England's most brutal dynastic conflict. Richard had seen betrayal up close and personal, and he understood how quickly loyalties could shift. He clawed his way to the throne, most likely by eliminating his nephews, the famous princes in the Tower. And then, once Richard was king, he ruled with fear. Every rival was a threat. Every alliance was suspect. But, as it turned out, that same dogged survival instinct, forged in blood and suspicion, made him incapable of recognizing a new political reality, one that required unity and compromise, not just brute power. So, when Henry Tudor rose against him, Richard responded with the same heavy hand. The only thing is, this time, it didn't work. Ultimately, Richard III died at Bosworth Field, the last English king to die in battle, and with him, the medieval era of monarchy also died. Or take Julius Caesar. In the years leading up to the Common Era, he had survived a political landscape where any kind of failure meant exile, or more likely, it meant death. He fought his way to supremacy through war, outmaneuvering rivals, and he saw betrayal at every turn. His past taught him that the only way to stay alive was to stay in control. So, when he returned to Rome, he didn't just settle for being first among equals. He declared himself dictator for life. But Rome wasn't ready for that. The Senate, already anxious by the shift in power to one man and his acolytes, saw Julius Caesar's desire to be emperor as the death of the Republic. Meanwhile, Caesar had spent too long in the trenches of survival to recognize that this moment called for restraint, not domination. He couldn't change gears, and so, on the Ides of March, he was assassinated by those who once claimed to be his allies, falling victim to the very fear he thought he'd left behind. And that's the point. These weren't fools. They were brilliant, experienced leaders who had earned their power the hard way. But they couldn't let go of their history. They saw darkness everywhere because challenges to their power and leadership were all they had ever known. And then those same instincts that had once saved them, those same instincts now betrayed them. Of course, I'm not suggesting that Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the greatest Jewish prophet, the greatest prophet of all time, is like Richard III or Julius Caesar. Of course not. I'm using historical example to illustrate the point, just like Moshe at Mei Merivah. They responded to what was happening in the present through the lens of the past. They reached for the old playbook in a moment that demanded something new and fresh, and in doing so, they sealed their fate. The Torah doesn't spell out Moshe's sin clearly, and perhaps that's the point. As Rav Hirsch says, the ambiguity is totally intentional. The Torah wants us to work for the answer. It wants us to explore the nuances of responsibility, because leadership isn't a simple journey of following instructions. It's much more than that. And most importantly, it comes with crushing expectations. That's why Mei Merivah is not just a story of failure. It's a window into the soul of leadership, a glimpse of how even the greatest among us can falter. Not because they are wicked, but because they are human and trapped by their history, however great they are. And when they get it wrong, the stakes are immense. Moshe's punishment wasn't in response to a momentary lapse. It was about a subtle breach in trust, a misalignment between divine will and prophetic action. And maybe, just maybe, it was also God's way of telling Moshe, your time is up. You've taken them this far. To go further, a new voice is needed. Now, let's explore how this moment sets the stage for a transition in leadership from Moshe to Yehoshua, and how sometimes the most faithful act a leader can ever perform is to let go. If we step back from the scene at Mei Merivah and ask ourselves what's really going on, we might come to a startling realization. Maybe this isn't a story about Moshe's mistake. Maybe it's a story about the inevitability of leadership turnover, not because of sin, but because of structure. The truth is, Moshe's so-called failure was not a moral lapse, but a natural boundary in his character. Moshe was no longer the leader the people needed, not because he failed them, but because they had changed, and leadership needed to change with them. Moshe was the right man to lead slaves out of Egypt. He was the man who could call down plagues, split seas, ascend mountains into fire and thunder, speak face to face with God. His leadership was epic, miraculous, even transcendent, but the generation of miracles was gone. The people standing at Mei Merivah were not the ones who crossed the Red Sea. They were born in the wilderness. Yes, they'd grown up eating man and living under the cloud, but they weren't yearning for freedom from slavery. They were yearning for normalcy, for land, for routine, for groundedness. And that's precisely what Moshe could not give them. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't built for it. Moshe was a man of extraordinary encounters. His world was governed by direct communication with God and by the suspension of natural order. But now the people were preparing to enter a world of farming, agriculture, of warfare, of politics, of civil society, a world where God would no longer speak from a cloud or split the earth or the sea or bring plagues. They needed a leader who lived among them, not above them. And Moshe wasn't built for that. This was the brilliance behind God's decision that Moshe would not enter the land. It wasn't a punishment. It was a strategic transition. Moshe's failure at Mei Merivah was symbolic. It marked the point where the two tracks diverged. The miraculous leader had to give way to the grounded one. And it's no coincidence that the successor was Yehoshua. Yehoshua wasn't flashy. He doesn't speak with God face to face. He doesn't carry a staff or perform miracles. He's a military man. He's a planner. He's a strategist. He represents the mundane holiness of conquest and settlement, not the transcendent holiness of Sinai and the desert. In a way, this mirrors a pattern we see throughout history. The first generation of any movement tends to be visionary and revolutionary, Think of the founders of the United States, Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington. All of them were brilliant, passionate, and occasionally combative. Then came the next generation, the administrators, the organizers, the system builders. They take the founding fathers' vision and make it sustainable. Even in our own tradition, this transition is embedded. The Mishnah tells us, Yofet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. Torah study is beautiful when combined with worldly occupation. You can't live forever on miraculous mon. Eventually, you have to plant wheat and bake bread. So what does this mean for Moshe? It means that his exclusion from the land of Israel, from Eretz Yisrael, isn't about a flash-in-the-pan mistake. It's not about a moment of anger. It's about a necessary handoff, a handover. As Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky writes in Emes Liyaakov, Moshe and Aaron represented a generation of supernatural redemption. But the conquest of the land required a leader who could operate within natural reality. Moshe was, in a sense, too great for the next phase. And make no mistake, it is very painful. Moshe pleads with God to let him enter. In Dvarim he begs, please let me cross the Jordan and see the good land. But God says no, not angrily, almost tenderly. Ravloch, he says, enough. Your mission is complete. And here is where Moshe's greatness shines at its brightest, because he accepts it. Moshe turns from personal disappointment to national vision. He begins to prepare the people for the future. He writes Sefer Devarim, a book of speeches, ethics, reminders. He teaches Torah not as fire from heaven, but as the foundation of society. Moshe doesn't storm off or sulk. He guides his people to the very edge of their destiny, knowing he won't be part of it. That is true greatness. Not miracle working, not staff wielding, but letting go with love. It's very great, and it's also very, very rare. And so Mei Merivah becomes more than a story of failure. It becomes a parable of transition, a moment of clarity that even the best leaders have a shelf life, not because they're flawed, but because the world around them changes. We often talk about legacy as meaning what we leave behind. But perhaps Moshe teaches us that legacy is also about knowing when to step aside, when to pass the baton, when to say, I've brought you this far, now it's your turn. So now let's turn to a deeper theological discussion. Let's talk about how Moshe's moment of anger, or misunderstanding, or whatever you want to call it, becomes a case study in the dangers of emotional incongruence between a prophet and his God. We'll explore Rambam. He has a radical idea that Moshe's greatest error was not an act of disobedience, but a moment of misrepresentation. God hadn't simply said to Moshe, it's time to pass the baton. He said, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me, you shall not bring this congregation into the land. Now, to the untrained ear, that doesn't sound like structural transition. It sounds like blame. It sounds like sin. So again, we can ask, what did Moshe do wrong? We already saw Rashi, Ramban, and Rambam earlier offer competing views. Let's return to the Rambam's formulation in more depth, because actually his version offers a profound theological and emotional insight. According to the Rambam, Moshe's error was not in what he did, but in how he felt, more precisely in how Moshe allowed his inner emotions to color his outward prophetic behavior. The Rambam writes that when Moshe called the people rebels, morim, and struck the rock in anger, he created the impression that God was furious. But God wasn't furious. God had simply wanted Moshe to speak gently to the rock and draw water. By reacting with a visible frustration, Moshe had distorted the divine image. Now, I don't want to overstate it, but let's face it, that's a devastating idea. It means a prophet is not just a mouthpiece. He or she is a mirror. He or she must reflect God's tone as well as his content. If God is calm, the prophet must be calm. If God is angry, the prophet is allowed to be angry. But to project divine wrath when God is not angry is a form of betrayal. In fact, it's a desecration. It's a chil Hashem. Let that sink in. According to the Rambam, Moshe failed not because of an incorrect action or word, but because he gave the people the wrong impression of God. In a modern idiom, we might call it emotional misalignment. Moshe's frustration, understandable though it was, made the people feel alienated from God. They had just lost Miriam. They were thirsty and vulnerable, and Moshe, their ultimate advocate, their shield, called them Merim. He called them rebels. But were they rebelling? Not really. As Rabbi Dunner has pointed out, the language of the people in the Mei Merivah story is far tamer than in earlier episodes of complaining. They don't demand to go back to Egypt. They don't threaten revolt. They simply say, why have you brought the congregation of God into this wilderness? It's a question, it's a cry. What it is not is a mutiny. And yet Moshe lashes out. Why did he do it? Maybe it's personal. He just lost his sister. As the Medrash says, Miriam's merit sustained the water. Her death wasn't a family bereavement, it was a national tragedy. It dried up the well, and now, in the shadow of grief, the people are complaining again. And it all feels like deja vu. It's Rafidim all over again. It's Kivrei Satava all over again. It's Korach all over again. Again and again, the people are moaning and complaining, ganging up against Moshe and Aaron. And so, Moshe snaps. But, and this is the key, God doesn't snap. It's this point that is at the core of the Rambam's explanation of what happened. A leader, especially a prophet, must keep his emotional state aligned with God. Because when people look at a prophet, they see God. And if they see God as angry or impatient or distant when he is not, it warps their relationship with him. It's hard to overstate how radical this idea is. We often think of leadership as a matter of competence, charisma, vision. But the Rambam is suggesting that the most essential quality of spiritual leadership is emotional integrity, the ability to project God's posture with fidelity. And this, says the Rambam, is why the punishment was so severe. Because when God is trying to build trust with a new generation, a generation that has never seen Egypt or the sea, he needs them to feel safe. He needs them to feel secure. He needs them to feel loved. And Moshe, even if it was just for a moment, and totally by mistake, conveyed the opposite. Let's be honest. This is a standard that feels impossibly high. Who among us has not let emotion slip into our leadership? Who hasn't raised a voice or made a face in frustration? And yet for Moshe, because he was Moshe, the bar was set much higher. In fact, and this is important, the lesson here isn't just about Moshe. It's about anyone in a position of religious authority, whether they are rabbis or teachers or parents. When you represent Torah, when you represent spiritually timeless values, people automatically assume you're speaking on God's behalf. That's a heavy responsibility, because if you speak harshly, they think God is harsh. And if you're impatient, they think God is impatient. But if you're kind, they feel God's kindness. This is especially important in today's world. We live in a time of disillusionment with religious authority. Scandals, hypocrisy, and insensitivity from leaders have left many people spiritually wounded. They don't just walk away from rabbis or institutions. They walk away from God. And that's the tragedy Moshe encounters in a single moment, which is why God's response is so pointed, so tough, so harsh, because the stakes are too high. God used this episode as a teaching moment for future generations, not in punishment, but in instruction. God was showing us what leadership demands, not perfection in results, but precision in representation. A prophet isn't judged by his success, but by his alignment with the divine. And, as I've said, but I'm going to extend it even further, it's not just about prophets. Every Jew is, in a sense, an ambassador of God. That's why we're called a kingdom of priests. Mamleches Koyanim v'Goy Kodosh. The world watches how we act. The world watches how we speak. The world watches how we react under pressure. And, having observed all these things, the world draws conclusions about the God we serve. That's a daunting thought. It sends a shiver down your spine, but it's also empowering because it means that by embodying kindness, calm, care, we bring God's presence into the world, not through miracles, but through our midos, our behavior. Before I conclude, let me return to the narrative at Mei Merivah one more time, this time through the lens of Rashbam and modern literary theory, to explore how the story signals a shift from divine wonder to human narrative. Here's the three questions that really demand an answer. Why does the Torah seem to under-explain this moment? Under-explain it. Why is it wrapped in ambiguity? And what does that tell us about the way Torah invites us to grow through questions, not just answers? We've traveled a long road with Moshe, from the shock of his punishment to the interpretive riches of Rashi, of Rambam, and modern scholars as well. We've seen how a single episode can contain so many angles and aspects, whether they are theological, emotional, psychological, or structural. But we're still left with one very uncomfortable truth. The Torah never says exactly what Moshe did wrong. It gives us the consequence. You did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the people. Therefore, you're not going into Eretz Yisrael. But it doesn't spell out the sin. Why? Why the ambiguity? The Rashbam, in his commentary on this episode, offers one of the most jarring and compelling readings in the medieval canon. He reads the story in context, not just of what should have happened, but what did happen. And his approach emphasizes something crucial. The Torah at times doesn't demand submission to mystery, but rather engagement with the text, even, or perhaps especially, when it makes us feel uncomfortable. Rashbam argues that Moshe's sin was a total failure to obey God's precise instruction. God had said to take the staff, presumably for symbolic purposes, gather the people, speak to the rock in their presence, and water would come out. Instead, Moshe took the staff and hit the rock twice without ever speaking to it. In Rashbam's rendering, it's not just a small deviation, it's a collapse of the entire divine instruction. It's as if Moshe reverted to an older version of himself from Shmos Perek Yud Zayin, where he was commanded to hit the rock. At that point, he was commanded to hit it. But that was decades ago. 4 decades, to be precise. Now, 40 years later, God expected something different, something gentler, more verbal, more fitting for a generation raised not on slavery, but on journey. But Moshe regressed. He acted as if nothing had changed. Rashbam is known for championing pshat, the straightforward contextual meaning of the text. But what's striking here is that his simple reading is more radical than many of the droshes, the more lyrical explanations. He takes the Torah at face value and says, Moshe just didn't do what God told him. Period. Well, do you find that satisfying? What are your thoughts? It's jarring, right? Because it doesn't account for Moshe's greatness, or his grief, or his weariness. But that's precisely the point. Rashbam teaches us that pshat can be brutally honest. The Torah isn't only a book of saints and angels, it's actually also about flawed humans trying to do the will of God in a world of shifting conditions and expectations. And that's what makes the story so timeless. Uriel Simon, in his brilliant essay on the phenomenon of biblical ambiguity, writes that the Torah's reluctance to pin down Moshe's sin is a deliberate feature, not a faulty omission. It invites generations of readers to wrestle, just as Moshe wrestled. The Torah becomes a text that demands interpretation. And in that process, we don't just understand Moshe, we understand ourselves. Rashbam's interpretation was so uncomfortable to later rabbis, particularly those who preferred to emphasize Moshe's infallibility, that some even tried to suppress it. In fact, Rashbam's commentaries were virtually unknown for centuries. It's only after manuscripts were rediscovered in the 19th century that his voice was restored to the conversation. But why was Rashbam censored? Because Rashbam's Moshe is fallible, Rashbam's God is too strict, and Rashbam's Torah is very raw. And yet, that's what makes it so powerful. It forces us to confront the dissonance and to acknowledge that even the greatest human being in Jewish history could make mistakes, and that God, in his inscrutable justice, could still love Moshe fiercely, even as he closed the door for him to the land of Israel. Rashbam's reading isn't meant to humiliate Moshe, it's meant to dignify the text, to say we can read honestly. We don't need to whitewash. Holiness doesn't require perfection, and the Torah doesn't demand that we sanitize our heroes, only that we learn from them. There's something beautifully modern about this. In a world increasingly allergic to uncertainty, the Torah refuses to give us a soundbite. It gives us ambiguity. It gives us silence where we crave explanation, and that silence becomes an opening. It's the same opening that exists in the phrase, Lo ha'emantem bi lahakdisheni. You did not believe in me to sanctify me. What does it mean to sanctify God? It's not about miracles or public relations. It's about embodying God's presence with precision, with grace, and with faith. That's what God expected from Moshe at Mei Merivah, and that's what the Torah expects from us. There's a final haunting detail that underscores all of this. After the incident at Mei Merivah, God doesn't strike Moshe down. He doesn't remove him from leadership. In fact, Moshe continues to lead the nation for many more chapters. And he's not a lame duck. On the contrary, he defeats Sichon and Og. He speaks the whole book of Dvarim. But the knowledge remains. He will not cross over the Jordan River. But why not let him into the land of Israel? At the end, let him get there, let him go. Many answers have been given, but perhaps the most moving one is this. Because the land of Israel requires not just faith, but adaptation. The wilderness was a place of divine miracles and top-down leadership. The land will demand different skills, strategy, compromise, human initiative. Moshe represented a paradigm, but no paradigm lasts forever. And here is where the message becomes deeply personal. We all have our Mei Merivah moments, when we act from habit instead of awareness, when we fail to evolve, when we speak or strike too quickly. We all have leadership roles, our shuls and in our communities, and we all struggle with a balance between representing values and embodying them. Moshe's story reminds us that even the holiest can stumble, but it also tells us that stumbling isn't the end. Moshe doesn't enter the land, but he becomes our eternal teacher. His failure becomes part of his greatness because he accepted God's decree with dignity. He mentored Yehoshua. He gave his final speeches. He died with a kiss from God. And we, his people, carry both his triumphs and his trials. The Torah doesn't tell us what his sin was because it wants us to live in that space of questioning, because that's where growth happens. It's in the ambiguity that we meet the divine. Moshe striking the rock at Mei Merivah is more than a moment of failure. It is a mirror. It's a mirror for every leader, every teacher, every parent, every human being who has ever shouldered responsibility and found themselves overwhelmed or misunderstood or misaligned. The Torah's silence about the precise sin is an invitation. It calls on us not to pass judgment, but to engage, to read deeply, and to ask, what does God really want from us, from me, from our words, from our actions, from our anger, from our trust? In the end, Moshe remains our greatest leader, not in spite of his flaw, but because of the way he bore it. He showed us that true greatness is not perfection, but the ability to keep leading, loving, and teaching, even when you know you won't make it to the finish line. And that perhaps is the holiest lesson of all. Well, that just about wraps it all up. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.